Hello, and welcome to Activating Sustainability, the Anthesis podcast. I'm your host, Chris Peterson, and we hope you're all doing really well. Today, I'm really excited to be digging in on a personal passion topic, which is energy, which represents 73% of global emissions and is facing a significant challenge in shifting from very stable, reliable, conservative business models and programs to dramatic transformations that will require significant reduction of 50% over the next 10 years and 100% over the next 20, 30 years that will be a real challenge for us to achieve, but is fundamental to us being able to achieve anything that we're hoping to from a climate change perspective. To help unpack this topic, to dig into it, I'm really excited today to be joined by Agneta Persson, who is Managing Director of Anthesis Group in Sweden, and Ben Lynch, who is Director at Anthesis out of the UK. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Hi, Chris. Great to join you today.
Thanks for inviting us.
Wonderful. Well, maybe to start us off, there's so much talk about the energy sector. Could maybe, Ben, do you want to set the stage of what's happening in the space?
Yes, I would say that pretty much for all of our colleagues across Anthesis and all of our clients, the big news in recent months has been the increase in the cost of energy, so particularly driven by wholesale gas prices, which are impacting on electricity prices. And also, I guess in parallel with that, I guess the two sort of met together in a sort of post-COP world, different countries looking at their routes to net zero and the most economically expeditious way of meeting those sort of net zero challenges. So when we sort of bring those things together, we actually have a very strong investment environment for energy efficiency and energy generation. Whilst there are challenges within that, that's been really great for me and for my team and for colleagues that I work with on the energy agenda.
I would like to add that when everything is happening so fast that it is currently, with the rapid electrification of the transport sector and the industrial sector, all sectors have to have a much broader perspective and work from an energy systems perspective, and not just having focus on their own part in the whole energy system. And the peak load is one of the lack of capacity, and peak load now is growing and growing, and that's a rapidly increasing problem we need to look in much more into.
For me, energy is a total nerd out, geek out topic that I love, right? But it's been amazing how it's kind of sat in the background for so long, right? As long as when you flip the switch, the lights come on. When you get in your car, you can fill it up at the gas station, etc. People just don't think about it, and it's amazing to see it kind of come to the forefront. So, Agneta, you mentioned peak load, but for those who aren't familiar with that, maybe do you want to explain that a little bit and maybe unpack some of these transition opportunities and some of the challenges we see around that as well?
Well, the peak load is needing electricity or any other kind of energy that is supplied at the same time. So all of us needing household electricity, for instance, at the same time, then the net is possibly not being able to supply what we need, or the industrial needs are also increasing, and some of the load of or the demand of energy from the industry is at the same time as the demand of energy in the households. And also now with all the electrification of the car fleets, that we will need to be much more interactive and finding solutions where we can shift load from one time to the other, so that everybody could have the electricity or the other energy like gas or other energy sources that they need. So it's about being able to get the energy at the time you want it.
Well, it's so funny to think that when you flip a switch, a kind of generating plant starts to go up, right? Like those are one to one at the way the system is generally set up today, which is just so shocking to think about, right? Like it's not the way we think about any equipment or material, et cetera. So I know kind of halftime at World Cup games are a nightmare for energy companies, right? How do you manage that of everybody going and putting in appetizers or turning the kettle on or whatever it may be around the world at the same time? And Agneta, you were mentioning some of the transition technologies. I know, Ben, that's an area that you are kind of intimately aware of and thinking about. As you think about that kind of electrification piece, what what's coming to mind for you, both in terms of the need and some of the opportunities within it?
Well, probably the main thing, which I think will become more relevant to a lot of businesses and also to domestic customers on the grid, is that then needs to be a greater reflection of the carbon intensity of the grid on an hour-by-hour basis, rather than the carbon intensity of the grid over the course of a year. And those carbon factors, will start feeding into price indicators as well on the grid. So there is likely to be, a greater commercial incentive to look at storage and, as Agneta said, shifting your peak load in order to meet lower carbon or periods on the grid where the grid is effectively lower carbon because there's a greater amount of renewable generation on the grid, and also points at which your cost for your power is lower and you're incentivized to do that. So a lot of the businesses that we're working with are starting to look at that forward view of how will that sort of incentivization start to shift on the grid, and how do you create energy consuming systems and controls that respond to those sort of market forces that are likely to emerge.
And what comes to my mind first is energy efficiency, because the less need of, or the less demand we have of energy, then the larger part will be renewable already now, and also it will reduce the peak load problems, and it will increase the security of supply, which is, as you mentioned before, Chris, it's strange that it hasn't been talked about as much as it should have been, because that's one of the cornerstones of the energy system and the energy policy as a whole. And with the new electricity and gas prices, and also other price of energy sources, energy efficiency is even more beneficial. There are so many different kind of actions you can take, and the potential for energy efficiency and the what's profitable is so large now. It has never been as large as it is now. And when you then factor in other socioeconomic benefits from energy efficiency, like reduced CO2 emissions and reduced health cost, because we get a more healthy environment and so on, then what's profitable is even larger potential.
Yeah, I would really second that in terms of the analysis that we have done on behalf of clients for investment in their portfolios to decarbonize their estates. Has really, if you look at the sort of investment opportunities, if you look at that via tools like MAC curves and sort of how you prioritize those investments, what we're actually seeing is that the case for energy efficiency is just getting better all the time. The shift from moving heating from, say, gas systems across to electrification, well, those gas and electric are kind of coupled in terms of the prices. So the biggest benefit that any organization or even any domestic customer on the grid can have at the moment is to focus on demand reduction and energy efficiency, and the business case for that is as good as I've ever seen it in the 15 years I've worked in the industry. So really, I think 2022 is the year of refocusing on that opportunity, looking again at the business case, looking at the broader socioeconomic benefits of energy efficiency, and really kind of realizing that opportunity.
And this makes it possible for the transformational change we need to see here. So it really paves the ground for doing much more, and not just work with incremental improvements, but also seeing how we can change all of it. And our clients have a totally different situation today than they had before.
Mm. And so maybe that doing much more, what do you think organizations and governments and stakeholders and companies should be doing maybe beyond energy efficiency?
So maybe to build on, maybe not answering your question directly, Chris, but to build on Agneta's point, as consumers on the grid have a challenge ahead of us, which is how do we work with the fact that the grid has to both accommodate greater capacity, greater peak loads, and greater levels of renewables integration in order to decarbonize power, particularly for everybody. So the way in which we do that in the most economically advantageous way to give the greatest socioeconomic benefits is to all look at how we reduce demand, and then that transition becomes, easier, smoother, at a lower cost for everybody. So there is a case here, that by making demand reduction, you reduce the cost of, power to all, because you're reducing the impacts of the capital infrastructure that's needed to support greater grid capacity.
Yeah, and it's so funny when we have conversations with clients or organizations and you talk about heating the outside, and it's that like, well, of course we wouldn't do that. It's like, yeah, but what insulation are you putting in your new building? And it's this aha moment of like, oh, wait a minute, yeah, how much are we paying for that, right? Which really, I think, exactly as you're saying, kind of sparks into those broader conversations. I've heard both of you mention some of those socioeconomic benefits. I'm just curious if you could unpack those a little bit more, as that's clearly kind of a desire to figure out how do we optimize not just the energy system, but the broader societal impacts as well. So be curious from your views in Sweden and the UK and broader European experience, what does that really look like?
Yes, there are so many different kind of benefits you get from energy efficiency, and the International Energy Agency published a report 2015 where they divided the different kind of benefits into 17 different categories, and there are very wide range of benefits, varying from reduced fuel poverty, improved health, and reduced cost for health for people, improved manufacturing capacity and manufacturing efficiency, and also reduced carbon emissions, reduced environmental impacts. So it's really a lot of different kinds of benefits, and some of them enter the society as a whole, and some of them goes to certain actors. But all of the different benefits are there, and you can calculate on many of them and make estimates in monetary values as well.
Yeah, fascinating. I know it's been interesting for me in conversation around electrification and transportation here in North America, the efforts of, say, the American Lung Association, right? And their research on, what are the health effects of burning fossil fuels, right? And just seeing that like direct one-to-one correlation between that of like, exactly like you're saying, what are some of those spill-on impacts and benefits associated with it?
Just to build on that as well from a UK perspective, I think it was last year in London, there was the first, for many years, the first sort of legally recognized death as a result of air quality. And the consequences of that in sort of legislative terms were that air quality became, moved into sort of a parallel legal or governmental concern as, climate change in London. So therefore, connecting together these sort of changes that need to be made to the energy system and understanding, the benefits realization of making those changes, and the different socioeconomic metrics that can support driving that change, is really important to bring those together, particularly when you're looking from a sort of governmental or infrastructure perspective. We're seeing that those are the things that start to make the more persuasive business cases for change.
And how are some of the established policies driving these changes? I think from a North American perspective, it's interesting because it's primarily driven by a stakeholder view, right? And I think so I do a lot of work with electric utilities. They're thinking 10, 20, 30 years out and trying to look at that. So kind of the trials and tribulations and varying opinions in various political parties doesn't necessarily affect them. It can be an accelerant to it or decelerate some of the things they're doing. But be curious from a European perspective, where policy seems to be more of a driver and have more influence on some of the decisions here. What does that really look like in practice?
Well, one policy measure we had in Sweden, where we have a very large share of heating of the buildings with district heating, is that there were requirements on the energy utilities to change from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. And the main driver when that was introduced, or one of the main drivers, was to reduce environmental impacts like particulate matter in the air quality, and other NOx and SOx and the other things that are generated when you are incinerating fossil fuels. So that was one of the main drivers. And then we got a more energy efficient system at the same time, because it's using the energy sources on a more rational way with reduced energy losses in the energy production in the district heating.
Yeah, it's probably manifesting in many, many different ways. You could talk about these central government efforts to decarbonize the grid via Ofgem and the price mechanisms that are in place to do that. But I guess the sort of the two things that we're seeing kind of entering into our world in the built environment are air quality zones, for which there are legal requirements around contributions to air quality. So that's driving any sort of new development or retrofit away from the combustion of fossil fuels and generally towards heat pumps, or sometimes towards district heating. And the other is the establishment of heat network zoning in some of our major towns and cities. And again, that is setting the sort of policy framework for the growth of interconnected heat networks and the interface between heat networks and the electricity grid. So there's obviously many, many policies that are sort of shaping our landscape, but I think those would be the ones that we're really seeing having an impact on development and planning at the moment.
And then on transport and mobility, there are also a lot of policy measures that actually drives this way, and like increased bicycle lanes in the street, in the cities, or increasing the parking costs for cars, and making different kind of measures to reduce the car use and increase the use of bicycles and walking, and also with public transport. That has also a very big impact both on energy demand and air quality.
And I think, like, as an energy nerd, you see energy everywhere, right? Like, it's every lamp you see, it's the dishwasher you buy, it's everything comes into it. But sorry, Ben, I think I cut you off there.
Yes, I think it's also worth sort of reflecting on in the lead up to this year's COP and kind of post COP, how different countries are sort of coalescing around future energy strategies. So, if you look at the UK's energy strategy, it's heavily reliant on decarbonisation of the grid through renewables. There is a sort of looming issue on how you transition away from gas power stations, and also supplementing some of the base load in the UK with nuclear, which has its own political challenges. But then if you look at somewhere like Japan or Australia, they're sort of pursuing a strategy which is more closely linked with green or blue hydrogen as the sort of main route to their transformation. Now, those are two very, very different approaches, two very, very different economic outlooks. And some of those are kind of driven by societal systems and sort of attitudes. Some of them are driven by historical sort of infrastructure and how that gets adapted. But all of these things are going to sort of play out into a very different kind of energy futures for these these different places. And probably further to that, I would add, you only have to look at in Europe the potential annexation of the Ukraine and the politics that are happening around the main sort of gas pipelines from Russia coming into Europe, whether Europe is willing to sort of sanction Russia for that potential sort of annexation or military movement. So energy is being used politically here as well, and all of these sorts of different sort of geopolitical drivers are shaping our energy systems, as well as the policies that we see kind of coming through post-COP.
And then coming back to the national levels or even regional levels, I think that the development where we have a large scale systems we already have, the infrastructure we already have, but we need to integrate the small scale with the large scale systems in a totally different way than we've been doing before. And that happens whether you want it or not, because there are so many actors now looking into how can we do it, and all the property owners are becoming both consumers and producers at the same time. So the change that is going on is really, really large.
Mm. Well, and I know I'm speaking with each of you, right? Like I think this is an area that we're all really excited and trying to dig in and figure like how do you drive that transition? But also I know I'm speaking with lots of people, it's pretty quick to come to task overload of just it's too complex, it's too hard to shift. You talk to grid operators and they're like, it is a house of cards, and you're trying to add in a bull into a china shop to with variable renewables and the whole bit. Maybe to just kind of bring it down to what should people be doing today to not get overwhelmed with that, to take some meaningful action and move things forward within the organization, be really helpful as we kind of look to wrap up with maybe some kind of tactical things people can be doing Monday morning when they come back into the office.
I mean, I would just come back to majoring on, if you look at forward prices for gas, we've moved from, certainly in the UK, but this is true, across Europe, from 50 pence a therm to something approaching 120, 130 pence a therm. So that's 2.5 to 3 times increase in the wholesale cost of gas. Similarly with electricity, it pretty much tracks in the same way on pounds per megawatt hour for forward delivery contracts, from about £50 a megawatt hour up to, again, sort of 120, 130 pounds a megawatt hour. So if you take those things together and assume that the geopolitical landscape, and assume that those drivers are going to remain for some time to come. Also, in some countries, particularly in I can speak for the UK, there are price caps for domestic customers. So to some extent, domestic customers are shielded. Commercial and industrial customers are far less shielded from the impacts of this. So I would come back to the principle of how do you control that risk? You control that risk by reducing your demand. You can control it to some extent with your procurement of utilities, but the best thing you can do and plan for managing that cost risk, managing that carbon risk, and managing security of supply risk is reduce demand. And that applies from the domestic customer through to heavy industrial, energy intensive industry.
And I was about to say almost the same thing. Start by looking on your demand of energy. How are you using energy today, and what kind of energy source are you using, and what's the peak load? When are you using the most? What can you do? What kind of actions do you have in your action plan on reducing your energy demand? If you don't have any, see to that you get an action plan with measures that you can do, because there are so many things that is cost efficient for you to do, and it will increase your balance line in the budget extremely much compared to other things you can do.
I would just sort of, again, to build on that. I mean, the other thing, because it's so salient at the moment, with prices driving activity, but coming back to the carbon principles of where we need to get to, if you actually look at across the built environment at the energy use intensity, which is the typical metric for energy consumption per meter squared or feet squared of floor area, we need to, in most use cases or most typologies, certainly more than reduce that by half within the next 5 years. We need to, almost get that demand down to a quarter or beyond of current levels by sort of 2035, 2040. So, the carbon imperative to reduce demand and support the decarbonisation of the grid is also huge. And there's so many clients that have had contact with where they're looking at their future build programs. They're building carbon deficits that we have to look at the building specs, look at what they're actually building, look at what that means in terms of a future projection of carbon use for those facilities, and those designs need radical change. And the same with retrofit. We need to go much, much deeper in terms of how we retrofit existing buildings to meet that climate change challenge.
And what's needed to get mobilized is, of course, that all the contractors and other actors who are working with renovation need to redesign their business models and business propositions for the property owners, so it's more attractive to start now to do something.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because I think for anybody that spends some time looking at the energy sector, you kind of pull your hair out thinking about like, why aren't people caring about this more, right? Because it's not a sexy topic, it's not super exciting, but as you were saying, Ben, is kind of there's a radical transformation that has to happen. It has to happen incredibly fast for an industry and a sector and every product that we're buying that is just monumental to contemplate, but also just absolutely fundamental to anything we're trying to achieve. So really appreciate the two of you helping to unpack that and get some additional insight on it. Maybe just kind of last question, is there a next step? Are there resources available that people should be kind of tapping into?
From my perspective, I would say if you have a, dusty old energy efficiency report on your shelves, revisit it. We are seeing paybacks for, simple implementation measures more than half. So I would really, really advise if, many organizations, many domestic customers have had advice on things that they can do to reduce demand and have maybe turned away from that because it doesn't meet a sort of predetermined hurdle rate or ROI. In many cases now it does. So I would highly recommend, dust off the old report, the old spreadsheet, look at that again. And the other thing, to your point of, this isn't the sort of sexiest corner of sustainability. However, investment on this agenda underpins so many other areas of sustainability. If you get this right, you can create value to your organization, which, creates opportunity to invest in sustainability, other areas of sustainability that are parallel importance.
And I think that decarbonization and energy demand and energy supply is too invisible. It's difficult to see it, and that's one of the reasons why we are not focusing as much on it as we should or would like to do. And if you could, as for instance, as a property owner, if you can make energy and carbon visible to your tenants, then probably you would get a much better interaction between yourself and the tenants. And that goes both for residential and non-residential buildings.
Right. Well, wonderful. And I know you're both too humble to kind of say the direct support you all can provide, but for anybody who is feeling overwhelmed, curious about how to move forward, looking at offsets and feeling like those are kind of just a penance that's being paid as opposed to what you're hearing from Agneta and Ben about how do you really integrate this into value creation and business models for your organization. Strongly encourage you to visit the Anthesis website that we'll post up in the podcast description. And we'll also include Ben and Agneta's contact information in there. So please feel free to reach out to them to get more information or get some insights about how to get this done. So thank you both so much. Really appreciate you joining the podcast today.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
Yeah, pleasure.
Great. And thank you all very much for listening. Really appreciate you joining us today. And as we're coming up to the end of the year, wishing everybody a very happy holiday season and a very safe, happy, and fun 2022. So thank you all very much.